Good afternoon, everybody. Everybody hear me? Welcome to Woodworking 101. If you're not here for Woodworking 101, I think it's down the hall. I've been told that we need to announce a few things. Wow, it got really dark for all of you, but really bright for me. Please silence your cell phones, and while you're playing all your mobile games during the talk, keep the brightness really low. Try not to swear out loud. Play something with very low intensity. Anyway, my name is Scott Rigby, and with me is my colleague Troy Skinner, and we're from Immersyve, and today we're going to be talking a lot about player autonomy and what we are going to call sort of the autonomous player or self-determined player. We're going to cover a lot of material today. Troy and I really worked very hard on trying to figure out how to create a deck that we could present that was meaningful in 45 to 50 minutes to leave time for Q&A. And it turned out to be pretty dense. So don't worry about writing everything down. If we zoom past slides, we are going to make the deck available for everybody. So just hopefully sit back, relax, open up your flasks, let the talk wash over you, and hopefully it'll be enjoyable for everybody. Let me tell you a little bit about Immersyve and who we are. We have been around for about 11 years now, and really we're sort of the intersection of two areas of expertise that mirror a bit of my background. I was on track to be a behavioral psychologist and a motivational psychologist. I was really interested in doing a lot of research on the fundamentals of motivation and behavior and engagement. And then right as I was finishing up my degree, the internet was invented, and because I was sort of a geek and a nerd, I got really excited about that. And I jumped ship out of academia, and I started what people now just call a digital agency. And we began to develop the first generation of web-based games and websites and other things for large media companies. So it was really cool to kind of be at the start of that industry and to have seen it grown. But in addition to that, there's also a pedigree of research and academic study behind all the work that we do. We're very much committed to only saying things that we have data to back up and to validating the things that we are saying, so that we're not simply trying to be out there as expert consultants with our particular model, but really when we have ideas to putting them to the test. And we're very fortunate to have, as part of our group at Immersyve, the founders of self-determination theory. And there's a long line, 30, actually over 40 years now of research in self-determination theory and principles of motivation and engagement that really underlie a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last 10 years in an applied way with the games industry. And we're going to be drawing on a lot of that as we go along. So that's a little bit about us. Let me give you the central thesis for today's talk, and that is that the most important thing to understand about gamers is how they spend their time. And the central pillar of how much time and energy they put towards a game is going to be very much based on how autonomously motivated they feel in playing that game. And we're going to come around to what we mean by autonomously motivated and spend quite a bit of time there, but I'm just going to whet your appetite a bit for this as a concept. But it's actually this autonomous motivation and the design elements that build more of an autonomy orientation and a self-determined orientation to play that result in more sustained engagement and ultimately all the other good things that everybody is excited about, like money, people loving the game, people talking about the game to other people, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the central thesis of the talk. And if you're like me, at this point, at every GDC talk, I become kind of like this guy. And I'm like, okay, that's great. It all sounds really good, but prove it. Let's start to get into some of the details and data that leads you to these conclusions. And so to do that, for the next little while, I'm going to turn over the mic here to my colleague Troy, and he's going to take us through some interesting market data.
Thank you, Scott. So excitingly, I'm going to show you a stat that explains the last 15 years of gaming on consoles. But to do that, I have to give you a series of nerdy slides kind of telling you a bunch of structural points. The first is all the sales numbers that I present in here are going to be North American sales. For those of you that aren't familiar with sales, the way things usually work is that North American sales will represent half of worldwide sales. It's not always true. If you're talking about European football versus American football, that's going to skew differently. But as a general rule of thumb, half and half is a good way to think about it. Every company, every analyst defines tiers of sales differently. I don't really care about how they define them, but I'm going to refer to some of them, so I'll throw some definitions up there and just speed through them. AAA plus is 250 million or more North American first 3 months. Clicker. Excuse me just a second. AAA is 150 million to 250 million. AA plus is 100 million to 150 million. You don't have to memorize all this. It'll come back to you. AA is 60 to 100 million. And then the last is single A, which I refer to as not winners, not because I don't feel charity for developers. I've been a developer. I've made some single A games. It's that not winners is an important distinction, and I've got my slides mixed up, but the reason it's important is while this line has been moving as development budgets have risen, the 60 million and below is generally the place where you fall below profitability based upon 25 to $30 million dev spends, worldwide marketing costs, giving the manufacturer his cut, giving the distributor his cut. You get below 60 million North American, you start not making money. The reason why this is so important is a lot of analysts will show you genre totals, and they roll up every game in that genre, whether or not it's profitable. So certain genres look like much better bets because lots of people are going after them unsuccessfully. What I'm doing in contrast to that, which is going to change some of the numbers you might be familiar with, is I'm only registering revenue on profitable titles. Because as game developers, while there's certain opportunities in our career to do things for passion, do things with sweat equity, a lot of times we get into other points in our career, what we're trying to do is we're trying to win in the marketplace. And so that's what this talk's about. So that's why I define things that way. I think other ways of approaching it are equally valid, but in this particular talk, we're looking at how to make money. So the other thing that I do that's odd to some analysts is I focus on genre characteristics that motivate purchase and engagement. Traditionally, how people look at genres is what's the camera angle? Is it first or third person? What's the core mechanic? Is it an action or a shooter game? What I'm looking at is what motivates play, what motivates purchase. Because again, from a development standpoint, that's what you're working on, as opposed to some of the more superficial aspects of game development. So those are the nerdy parts. Now I'm going to rewind time back to 2001 so that the shifts in consumer behavior that shape today's market will become really obvious. So 2001 and 2003, an asteroid hits. Why I put things in 3-year chunks, probably the last nerd point of the day, is that huge hits are disproportionately, make a ton of money. So when GTA ships affects a genre total. If you put things in 3-year chunks, it smooths out the market. You can see trends better. If you do it year by year, things get really jagged. So what's the asteroid? 2001, modern gaming begins with the launch of Grand Theft Auto and Halo. It's going to take a few years, but the asteroid is going to start killing off some dinosaurs, which will affect what options we have as game developers. In this period, single-player narrative games, by which I mean 8 to 12-hour primary linear experiences, great cinematics, great core mechanics, handcrafted gameplay, they're the top genre. They represent $1.1 billion of profitable revenue in this period. Go to the next period, 2004 to 2006. Halo 2 ships and tips the shooter market from PC to console. Even though Halo 1 shipped in 2001, PC gamers or shooters players were still predominantly on the PC. They're playing Counter-Strike, they're playing Team Fortress, they're playing Wolfenstein. There weren't enough Xboxes in the world to tip the market. Those problems get solved as time passes. Halo 2 comes out, shooter market moves to console. And you can see that in the revenue. In the previous period, it was 200 million, I can't even remember. It's up 800 million now. In this period, we see our single-player narrative genre start to decline. It loses $450 million from the previous period. And we're going to say goodbye to all non-legacy Nintendo platformers. Essentially, Nintendo can still make them, but everyone else, they no longer are AAA games. After this period, they're not even AA games. They drop into the single A category. So this is our first genre that used to rule the world that we see going away. We go to the next period, 2007, 2009, when adaptation begins. New genres, hybrid genres start being successful. So 2007, Call of Duty blows up. You can see it in the revenue totals. We were at $1 billion before. Now we're at $2.6 billion in genre revenue in this period. And they did two things. I think people generally recognize the move to modern war. Obviously, what happened is World War II was what was dominating shooters before that. That's someone else's war. After Desert Storm, images on CNN, contemporary gamers had a totally different reference for war. Call of Duty was the first one to make that mainstream. But really the more important thing is they incorporated RPG mechanics in a very successful way. Why this is super important is when people make multiplayer games, oftentimes they think who they have to take care of is their best players. But from a motivational standpoint, the best players are already having the best time of their life because their kill-to-death ratios are 20-2. They're already having the best game ever. Who's not having a good time are bad players.
That's me.
Yeah, Scott. I didn't want to really call him out, but here he is.
My call sign is Target.
Actually, it's Bloodstain. We've changed it. So what happens is that when you have RPG mechanics, the bottom players, it changes the rule set from being skilled contingent, which is you have a good time and you progress if you're good, to engagement contingent. If you just show up, you make progress. Just showing up and making progress makes the genre more mainstream, grows the market. So what this looks like is traditionally in multiplayer shooters, only 25% of the audience converts from being a single player to being a multiplayer player. Call of Duty, with a more gentle RPG mechanic, converted 35% of its players to multiplayer, and it was a much larger share of people. Halo was sitting at 250 million. Call of Duty is going to climb up to $1 billion in North American revenue. So not only do they convert more players, but they massively expand the market, right? So the next point, Assassin's Creed launches. Essentially after GTA launched, no one could figure out how to make open world games for 6 years. Assassin's Creed was the first person to really be able to do that repetitively. Lots of other people would jump in and make one game and then fall away. Assassin's Creed landed time after time. And I'm going to develop this more later in the presentation, but what's interesting is traditionally it's an action game, heavy narrative elements, but it's becoming open world, drives a lot more revenue, just as we see single player narrative only games declining in revenue. So we're going to follow this trend. Left 4 Dead establishes a co-op focused only shooter at AAA levels, first time that happens. And then, of course, Minecraft and League of Legends happens off stage on the PC. That we'll pull in some of that stuff later. Then our current period, or almost our current period, the New World Order. Everything's a hybrid. So Call of Duty franchise peaks with Black Ops at 910 million North American. Arkham Asylum was a single player 8 to 12 hour narrative game. Arkham City moves the the franchise to open world, almost doubling its revenue and abandoning a genre that was going away. Skyrim doubles Fallout 3 sales, continuing Bethesda's string of 4 games in succession that each double. It's a slightly different story. They do it by becoming more accessible, more mainstream. And then Borderlands, I like saying this. Borderlands 2 hits AAA. It's a co-op, open world RPG shooter. So it's got 4 different DNA strands there. Different analysts can classify that in different places. For this presentation, I put in RPG, but it's a point we can debate. And then going back to the king of the world, single-player narrative genre, which was the king of the world in 2001, is all but dead, which seems impossible, right? We know lots of great single-player games that are still coming out. They're getting great reviews. We're seeing them mentioned all the time. How can I possibly say that it has this small little nib of revenue? This sounds like bullshit. Well, this is what's happening. The genre turns out several well-respected, often well-reviewed, but very poor-selling games. So things like BioShock 2, which I love, not as much as I love BioShock Infinite, but I love it. Kind of being mean because it's just 2 million under the threshold at 58 million. Max Payne, which comes from Rockstar, that has 2 AAA franchises, but they can't get this genre up to AAA. We've got Dishonored, which is a great game, Hitman, Dead Space, all from great developers, great publishers, but they're not successful. So that's the stage being set. So here's the one stat we promised at the beginning. Explains why platformers, racing games, and narrative games died. It explains why multiplayer shooters, open world games, and RPGs are winning. So first, just because I have to tease the point as long as possible, here are the AAA games sorted by the stat without me telling you what the stat is. And as someone that works with data a lot, I can tell my stat's awesome because you can see the games that make 750 million and 900 million and 800 million are at the top. And the games at the bottom make 150 million or 200 million. And so it has a lot of explanatory power, way more than something like review scores or PR hits or marketing budgets, things that you traditionally think about as driving the market. So what's the stat? Well, essentially, if a player plays a particular game, say Arkham City, how many days do they play the game before quitting? Essentially, the stat is, on average, how many days does a player play a game before quitting? So let's scrape all player data in the world, average it all together, who gets the most game time? So you put the stat up. You can see the average days played for Modern Warfare 2 is 49 days. You can see that it goes down to 40 for the other Call of Duty games, drops into the 30s for Halo. Top games, keep moving on down. At the bottom, you're at 10, 14 days. Correlates enormously strongly with sales. So I want to put the 49 days in context a little bit. When a gamer buys, a core gamer, buys a new game, they binge for the first 2 weeks. They play 4 to 5 days in the first 2 weeks. So 9 of those 49 days represents 2 weeks of gameplay. Then they cycle down and start playing 2 to 3 days a week. So the next 40 days represents 15 to 20 weeks of gameplay, Call of Duty. So in all total, we're looking at 17, 20 weeks, right? But here's the thing. Remember I told you earlier that only 35% of Call of Duty players play competitive multiplayer. That's where all the time comes from. Those 49 days include all the people just playing the single-player campaign. So 49 days isn't 15 to 20 weeks. It's a year for competitive multiplayer players. And then it's getting dragged down to 49 days by all the people who played about 6 days of the single-player campaign. So people usually have this idea wrong about core gamers. They oftentimes think they're price sensitive. They're not at all. There's no elasticity. If you drop price on games, it does not increase sales. But they're enormously value sensitive. The key driver in the core gaming market is their anticipation for how long they plan to play a game. They care a lot for how long the game's going to last for them. They don't have very much utility for an 8 to 12 hour game, so not as many people buy it. They have a lot of utility for something they're going to play a year, so lots of people buy it. What genres does this represent? It's not shocking. Everyone's an expert in this room, so you recognize the genres. Some multiplayer shooters at the top. In the middle, we start seeing some RPGs, then a couple of open world games. Nowhere do we see platformers, racing games, or narrative games. They can't hit AAA because they can't sustain engagement this long. So my data is already awesome, but it gets awesomer when you pull in the AA games because the relationship's even stronger. So you go down to the AA games that make between $60 and $100 million of revenue, and you can see the days drop down. Essentially, they sit between 4 and 10 days. I can tell you individual stories about Mass Effect, Fallout, and Rainbow Six, why they don't capture as much revenue as days, but it would take too long. They're all good stories, though. You should come back for them later. Some people are more visual. I am one of those people. This is them all plotted on the graph. On the x-axis, we have revenue. On the y-axis, we have days. You can see how strong the relationship is because there's a line from the bottom left to the top right. All the AA games sit in the corner. Essentially, they can't grow their revenue because they can't grow their days. If you ask a developer, I mentioned this, I started as a game designer. I've been a producer, so I'm a developer before I came down in the world and became a researcher. But if you ask a developer what makes a game successful, they say quality, which makes sense. It's what we have control over as a developer. We don't control the marketing campaign. We don't control how well we're funded always. We control what we make. So quality is what we care about the most. So let's look at that relationship. I'm going to have to warn you because I think there's going to be some cries of terror when you see this. An artist touched a lot of these slides, but I made this one myself. So it kind of looks like a Christmas tree. I get this a lot. This is what happens when a researcher's left alone in a hotel room.
That's why the world needs artists.
Exactly. In green, and I think it really stands out, so that's my argument for green, are the AAA games. In red are the AA games. I essentially sorted them. Games 90 and above are on, stage, whatever. On the left-hand side, games 89 and below are on the right-hand side. You can see there's some explanatory power in reviews. Some of the top games like GTA 5 and Elder Scrolls make a ton of money. You can see some of the games that are reviewed not as well, don't make as much money, but the relationship in the middle is nonsense. You get something like Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2 at 94%, making $750 million, and Street Fighter at 94%, making $75 million. So while all these games are quality, obviously, incremental quality does not explain increased revenue, right? Nowhere near as strong a relationship as what we saw earlier with the number of days on average people play. So I'm going to show this slightly differently. Quality matters, but not as much as DNA. So you go genre by genre. You take multiplayer shooters. Call of Duty is obviously a perfect example of that. If a game has AAA revenue, on average it gets played 28 days. If it only gets AA revenue, on average it gets played 9 days. You go to open world RPG, which I just made up a genre here, but I said I would do that because it's about how players get motivated. I'll get into this more later. If it's AAA revenue, on average it's 21.5 days. AA revenue, on average 7 days. You go down to open world, AAA 15, AA 8. Co-op shooter, 15 and 6.5. Single player narrative, we don't have any AAA games anymore, but on average they get played 6 days. Now I'm going to turn over to Scott to talk about what's going on with players psychologically.
Thanks. So, hopefully that starts to make the case for we need to sustain engagement with players in order to really break out and have really profitable games and exciting games. That alone is not as exciting to see the validation for that in the market data, but of course it's kind of like saying, hey, if somebody spends more time with you, they like you, so get them to spend more time with you. And you're like, okay, should I, what's next? What does that entail? We need a little bit more detail in order to make that happen. So that's what we want to do next. And this is where we want to dive into this concept of the autonomous player. Because what we found in our research, and really our DNA as a company, has been to look very, very deeply at, as people are playing games, what is their experience of playing those games along multiple dimensions, which I'm going to touch on. And how do those metrics of experience actually correlate with whether or not they will reach the sustained engagement and increasing number of days played. And so let's start off just by talking about this idea of autonomy. And what do we mean by autonomous? Because, it's a word that I've discovered. Everybody, if I were to say, do you know what autonomy means? Everybody here is a very smart person and would say, sure, I know what autonomy means. But the reality is that because I'm a social science nerd, I would be like, well, you're probably not quite right about that. And we're going to get into sort of what that nuance is, because it turns out to be really important, and important in ways that I think is very empowering to the development community. I hope is very empowering to the development community. So when I say autonomous, what we mean is somebody feels very, to use a little bit of a fancy talk word, agentic. They feel like they are the ones that are the author of their lives. They don't feel it just in a macro sense of they're trying to plot out their course from birth to death. They want to feel it over the course of their day. They want to feel it over the course of their play session. They want to feel it over the course of week to week and month to month and in their career. They want to feel like they're the ones authoring what's going on. They do not want to feel, by contrast, controlled. They don't want to feel manipulated. Even if that manipulation, by the way, is a positive manipulation. And I've given whole GDC talks just on, for example, rewards and reward mechanics and how they can actually backfire because they have a way of controlling people and robbing them of this sense of autonomy. And so one of the key words that we use when we talk about the autonomous player is this idea of volition. And the reason we use the word volition is a lot of people think of autonomy as freedom, right? If I were to, it's too big an audience, we don't have enough time to take a poll. I've done this before, and a lot of people would say, well, it means freedom and independence, and I can do whatever I want. But that actually isn't what autonomy means. It's not independence. It's volition. And the difference is, just think about in the course of your lives, you make a lot of volitional decisions to actually move away from being independent. So, for example, I'm very, very dependent on my wife, and I volitionally made that decision, and I love being dependent on my wife. I moved away from independence into a state of dependence, but I was the author of that decision. I felt very volitional about it, and I've gotten a lot of benefits from it. And there are lots of other examples that I could bring up, but you get the idea here, which is that volition simply means that I endorse the path that I'm on. and I'm leaning forward into that, and I feel like this is where I want to be going, right? It's not independence. This is going to be very important as we begin to go through what it means to be fostering an autonomous player, because one thing that often happens as I talk about the concept of autonomy is at this point people think, oh, we just need to start to make more choices and make things open and do all these sorts of very big things so that people feel that they have all the degrees of freedom in the world. And I'm actually not saying that, because players actually want something. They want structure. They want to have structure, and they also want to feel autonomous. And I'm going to put a slide up here that might feel like, well, did this accidentally get into your presentation because it's not about video games? And no, I put it in deliberately. This is from a study that was done by some colleagues of mine looking at learning environments. And again, we do a lot of work across multiple areas, not just gaming. And in this particular study, what they were looking at is, when you look at students, do they feel autonomous about doing their work? And they looked at two sets of variables. They looked at, number one, how much structure was there in the classroom? In terms of, here's the course of the day, here are the goals for the curriculum, here's what we're going to be doing, et cetera, et cetera. And then they looked at the teacher, and they looked at how autonomy supportive, and we're going to talk about what it means to be autonomy supportive in just a few minutes. But how autonomy supportive was the teacher? And then they looked at what was the overall experience of autonomy on the part of the student. And what they found here is the bar all the way on the right was the highest amount of autonomy on the part of the student, and it was in circumstances, I don't know if you can read it, where there was both a high level of autonomy support by the teacher in the classroom, but also a high level of structure. So this again reinforces the point that we actually, in order to create these great situations for our players, to be able to have really autonomous experiences and want to keep playing the game, we have to do our jobs as designers and developers and create awesome structures that give them a reason to want to be coming back and volitionally leaning forward into our game session after session, day after day, week after week, month after month. And Troy made the very compelling case for why that's important for the bottom line, but I think it's kind of what we all spiritually want to have happen with our games as well. So, what are the characteristics, right, of this autonomous motivation? And I want to touch on something here. I've probably given maybe 10 different talks over the last decade at GDCs about the basic need satisfactions and the player experience of need satisfaction, but I want to touch on it again here very quickly. And what a lot of the research has shown that we've done both in games and outside of games is that there are, in the same way that we have basic physiological needs, such as the need for hunger and the need for food and the need for water, we also have psychological needs. And they're global and they're universal. It doesn't matter if you're in the North American market or in the Asian market, you still have to eat, right? Similarly, there are certain psychological needs that need to be satisfied. Also, by the way, it doesn't matter whether you believe in these needs or not. The same way, if you don't believe in food, you still kind of need to eat it or you'll run into trouble, right? These are very, very basic needs that are operating all the time, and those needs are the needs for competence, relatedness, and autonomy, and I'm going to touch on each of those very quickly. So competence, I'll start with that one because it comes very naturally to game developers. It's sort of where video games got their start, at least in terms of video games making it to the mass market. And that's the need to feel successful, to feel efficacious. And also to feel this need of growth and progression, that I'm stretching my abilities, optimal challenge, flow states, all things that people have probably heard about in various contexts and various GDC talks and have thought about in their design. These are all related to this idea of competence satisfaction. The second, which obviously is a key pillar of the talk that we're giving today, is this need for autonomy, and I've already defined that, I think, pretty in a lot of detail. And then the third is the need for relatedness. And relatedness, the heuristic way to understand that is, I want to feel like I matter to you. I want to feel like you matter to me. It's not, I want to have 1 billion friends on Facebook. It's not, let's just social network the hell out of our lives. It's that we want to have these sort of meaningful connections. I want to feel like you respect me, you support me, you're behind me, and that we kind of have this sort of mutual relationship. And there are ways in which games can very successfully create mechanics in order to build on that. Unfortunately, today we don't have a lot of time to go into. I mean, we could easily do days, and we do workshops for days on each of these needs. We won't have time to go into them in a lot of detail, but these are very, very core needs that when they're satisfied and when we facilitate their satisfaction, we help to create more autonomous players, right? And through the mechanics and the different design elements and content elements in a game, you can satisfy each of these needs: competence, autonomy, and relatedness. So I'm going to put a grid up here and just talk about some of the things that we look at when we look at the satisfaction of these needs. So in the realm of competence, we look at, as I said, moment-to-moment success. How well is a game providing a sense of immediate feedback and density of feedback and moment-to-moment success in what the person's doing? Where are the lags? Where are the lulls? And you'll see very clearly that if you don't have the right kind of feedback, people are going to churn out. Competence is something you absolutely have to achieve in order for players to even engage your game for an hour. Then there's this idea of progressive growth. Beyond just feeling like I aimed at the target and I hit the target, I want to feel like I'm growing over time. I'm growing between sessions. I'm growing between days, weeks, months, et cetera, et cetera. This idea of progressive growth is very important. By the way, as I fill in this chart at the end of it, I think one thing that you might notice is it's not specific just to games. It's specific to us as people. This is something that we just naturally want to have in our lives, regardless of the domain, whether we're playing games or at work or at school or wherever we might be. Another is optimal challenge, right? And this is one that I think game developers are very familiar with. As a matter of fact, we're going to make the point in just a moment, sometimes a little bit too much in love with. This idea of, well, I need to create a challenge, keep people in a flow state. They need to always be white-knuckling it, just a little, stretching themselves further and further. And that's kind of what you're aiming for in terms of tuning your game. It is true, and I understand why this is something that developers do, because when players do like that experience, we like to feel our abilities stretched. The question is whether or not stretching those abilities continuously always leads to sustained engagement. We'll get to that in just a minute. Relatedness. One quick idea here is this idea of 1 + 1 = 3, right? If you're a tank and I'm a healer, great mechanic, we can both go out by ourselves and be successful killing, hogs and squirrels and whatever. But if we team up, we can go kill dragons, right? Because we're helping each other. And the mechanic itself communicates that you matter to me and I matter to you. Right? So the game design is fostering that core need satisfaction. It's also helping us not just in the moment of killing the dragon or what's happening in that particular session, but we can be helping each other in order to grow over time. And again, it's tied very much into this idea of personal growth, both for us as an individual, but then also you can see these mechanics beginning to expand out to include things like my guild leveling up and having growth and us all kind of working together in multiple ways. And then another way in which relatedness can be satisfied in games is having a very strong narrative that builds a connection to NPCs and to game characters generally. You might call this the Inigo Montoya effect. It's sort of like, you killed my father, prepare to die. And it's sort of like, you're behind that revenge motive. Otherwise it's like, why is he storming the castle? What's the point? Well, you killed my father. Sorry, I don't do a very good Inigo Montoya. But I'm going to be doing it several times throughout the rest of the presentation. So then we turn to autonomy. And of course, autonomy is about this idea of volition. And a lot of the mechanics that build this volition, one is the player wants to have interesting and meaningful goals so that they can be the author of their lives in your game, right? They are creating their narrative, their story. They're choosing between the goals that you're presenting to them in a way that is meaningful to them based on their own interests. And also, they see what we sometimes call a density of opportunity. One of the awesome things about games is you flip on a game and there's suddenly, if it's done well, so many things to do. So there's just so many opportunities available to you. I'm old enough that I remember the time before there was video games. And I would come home from school, and it's like, maybe I could talk my mom into driving me to the mall and, sitting around and have a milkshake or something, but, I mean, now you can just fire up tablets or flip on your console and you can be a hero in any number of worlds ranging from fantasy to science fiction to whatever. There's all this density of opportunity in order to create your own story and to be very volitionally engaged in it. And the key thing here is to not manipulate the players, right? So volition, not manipulation in design. The reason I'm saying that, and we're going to come back to it, is oftentimes as designers and developers, and reasonable people can disagree on this, but we've got a lot of market data, and Troy's presented some of it to back it up, is if you want to pull the player along on your experience, the one that you think is going to be fun, maybe make some movies or something. But that's not necessarily what the player is going to want to do. And what the market is showing is that games that have that as part of their DNA are actually starting to die out. So now that I've gone over this grid, and I've touched on these things very lightly, again, we could go for hours on each of these different components, I want to start taking some things away. Because in some ways, we want to give you guys the most parsimonious, actionable model to reach sustained engagement. So certain mechanics across this grid have more payload than others with respect to facilitating sustained engagement specifically. And I have to tell you that I was a little bit concerned about this portion of the talk because as I take things away from this grid, I don't want you to think that they're not important. They are important. They're just not important to sustained engagement relative to the other things that we're going to leave up here. And I think, you know, as you're taking notes or whatever, that's a very important point to make. So the first thing here is I'm going to take away moment-to-moment success, and I'm going to take away optimal challenge from the competence category. The reason I'm taking those things away is that they are things that characterize where games were and basically what almost the entirety of what the arcade era was about. But we absolutely do not see, no matter how high people's scores are on these different dimensions of getting a lot of feedback about being successful in the moment and feeling a sense of strong optimal challenge and even flow for extended periods of time, we do not see that being related to sustained engagement. And so they are necessary conditions for people to like your game, but they're just not sufficient for sustained engagement. They aren't really part of what we would call the constellation or the profile for what we're calling the autonomous player. The next thing I want to do, coming back to our grid, is there's another thing that I want to take off of here, which I think is going to be somewhat controversial, but maybe not surprising, given what Troy had talked about, and that is the narrative. Creating a strong narrative within the game. Creating the sense of the narrative is what is going to drive people forward and keep people engaged and immerse people in my game. Why are we de-emphasizing narrative? Well, in some ways we've already covered it, which is that narrative-heavy games are very cool in the moment. And I have to tell you that when we do testing of games, and we test games that are really, you know, you can look at your Uncharted, you can look at your BioShocks, you can see people very much enjoying the narrative elements and feeling in that moment immersed, but they don't have that desire to return to the game, and they don't anticipate wanting to play the game for more than a couple of hours. And so it's not a heavy contributor to sustained engagement. So before I really piss off the people in the room who are writing stories and have stories to tell, I want to come to this point of, am I saying story doesn't matter? Because anybody that's been to one or more GDCs has probably been to a talk, if you've gone to the design track, about story, should there be story in video games? And then there's this spirited debate. It's like watching, you know, a Republican and a Democrat fight on CNN or something, right? Like, no, we don't need story. Yes, story is everything. No, we don't. And I think the whole debate, in some ways, I think we're kind of asking the wrong question. I actually think story is important. It's just we have to understand the context of when story is important with respect to the player. We need to pass it through this motivational framework that we're talking about. And so it absolutely matters. Story matters in order to create volition. Again, remember my bad Inigo Montoya imitation. If we want to create this sense of meaningful goals, which is a part of autonomy, where people are going to lean forward into, I want to go storm the castle, or I want to do this, or I want to do that. We want to create that high-structured environment, which is very much conducive towards autonomy. Then narrative is one of the key ways in which we do that, because it's one of the ways that we entice players to lean forward rather than trying to control them, right? So what we want to do is we have to understand our players are going to be skeptical whenever they're, confronted with something in the game. They know there's a developer behind it, and you've got to convince them rather than trying to control them. I want to hire this kid. I don't know how old he is now, but I just kind of like his attitude. So really, it's about how narrative is used in design that really deeply matters to sustain engagement, right? And so, the issue is that making narrative the primary tentpole in your game, and again, the point's already been made. It's dying off, with respect to it being games that make money. In some ways, I'm kind of sad about that because I do enjoy these handcrafted 8 to 12-hour experiences. But, we need to go where the market's going. The world changes. The other problem with these sorts of narratives isn't just that once I'm done with it, once I meet the femme fatale and I light her cigarette and she says something witty, once I've done that, I don't really need to do that again. That's problem one. Problem two is, what if it's something I don't really feel like doing? What if you as a designer has made this kind of a core pillar of the game, but it's not something I really want to do? So you can think about in, L.A. Noire, the character behaving in unsavory ways, having an affair. If you have those sorts of things as a necessary or a forced narrative thread in the game, and it's important for the structure, you really run the risk of churning people out. Because what you've done is you've undermined their volition. You've undermined their need for autonomy. You've basically turned them away from the experience of being an autonomous player. So again, this falls into that category of feeling manipulated. So these are examples of how we feel that narrative is often misused in games. But narrative, as I was saying before, linking narrative to growth and to goals is an amazing way to enhance the meaningfulness of those goals and the meaningfulness of those options to players. As a matter of fact, if you don't give people a reason to do something in a game, just putting stuff in there isn't going to be enough. They need to be meaningful to people. They need to be interesting to people, and narrative is a very important way in which you can do that. And so the bottom line is narratives are not sufficient by themselves. It's the linking of these narratives. They're valuable when they're linked to mechanics that are promoting of the things that we've been talking about. Progressive growth, discovery, creating meaningful choices. This is where narrative can really shine. And so what we come back to then is this sort of matrix, and we've left kind of 6 things on here of need-satisfying mechanics that we've found are most conducive to sustained engagement. And I just want to touch on them quickly. We don't have too much more time. Progressive growth, this idea that when I'm actually going through the game, I can see the opportunities for me to move forward, not just going from level 2 to level 3, but the fact that going from level 2 to level 3 is actually going to unlock something for me that lets me do something new and interesting, right? The 1 + 1 = 3 mechanics, this tank healer mechanic that we were talking about. We see this not only as something that has been around for a while in console games and in MMOs, but you start to see more and more things also happening in the mobile and tablet market. So support for personal collective growth. So you look at a game like Clash of Clans, where it has this really fantastic, very simple altruism mechanic. It's like, okay, I'm going to donate troops to you to help you be more successful. And people are giving to one another all the time. And all the research that we're doing on altruism is showing when people behave altruistically, everybody wins. As a matter of fact, the person that does the giving actually gets more psychological benefit than the person that actually received things. So everybody is winning when these altruism mechanics are added in. Meaningful choice in activities and goals. I can't remember what it cost. It was like $2 or something in Black Flag. And I got to see everything on the map. And there might be some purists who'd be like, that's cheating. You have to discover it. And I was like, no, you know what? I don't want to discover it. I'll pay $2 extra so that I can see all the opportunities that are available to me in order to go and storm fortresses and find treasure. That doesn't mean every activity is going to be interesting, but I get to choose. I want to see that kind of density so that I can decide what's meaningful to me. So I want to talk about a couple of mechanics that are global, that really cut across all three needs. And there are four key things to touch on quickly. One is the idea of informational feedback. And informational feedback, what that really means is any feedback that's helping me to get better and to grow. It doesn't matter whether in the moment I've succeeded or failed. If you give me feedback that lets me do better next time, the person will be motivated. And we've seen this time and time again. Somebody gets just face rolled doing something, but the game gives them some kind of feedback to help them do better on the next iteration. They'll actually feel more motivated and lean forward into the experience. It's not the winning or losing, it's the informational feedback on growth. And similarly, is the game giving people enough information about the opportunities that are available to them in the game? The second is related to this idea of density of opportunity, and that's telegraphing opportunities. You know, a lot of times developers are saying, well, if I want to sustain engagement, I gotta spread this content out, man. I can't just, if people are going to binge on it in 2 weeks, I got to put some stuff out there so they can't see it. The problem is that if a player isn't aware of what's coming, it may as well not exist, right? So you need to find ways to what we call telegraph future opportunities, even if players can't actually get to that opportunity in the moment or for hours to come. An early example we saw of this was in Fallout 3, where, you know, Bethesda used to have a formula. They changed it a bit with Skyrim, where you started out in a really constrained space. In Fallout 3, you were in the vault, and then you would then have to do a very small set of things, and you had to go through a relatively linear story, and then you got set free into this open world. And we actually saw, when we looked at the data, that when people were in that first 90 minutes in the vault, and that's what this graph is, you know, we did see that their autonomy scores were lower, and that as a result, their purchase intent was lower in the vault versus going into the open world environment. But interestingly, we actually saw autonomy scores take a spike while they were in the vault, and we were very curious about why that happened. And so when we looked at the data in a lot more detail, what we discovered was that it happened right around the time they took this thing called the GOAT test, where even though they weren't allowed to do all the cool things they could do in the open world, they were exposed to what was coming. So they would take this GOAT test, and it would tell them, well, what would you like to learn about? And then it gave them a huge list of like alien weaponry and flying to the moon and, you know, all this stuff, which clearly telegraphed that the game was going to be offering all this opportunity. And because of that, the game created something that's very important, which is the anticipation of meaningful choice, the anticipation of need satisfaction in gameplay, even if that choice is hours away. And of course, there's lots of ways this is done. You can do it on with map mechanics and showing different opportunities. You know, there is no one right way to do this. It's really the core psychological principle that we're trying to communicate. And the last thing that I want to communicate with respect to the global mechanic to help create this autonomous player is the idea to stop thinking in terms of reward mechanics, because rewards themselves can often feel controlling, and instead think about things that are more rewarding mechanics, right? I mean, players really aren't looking for baubles and you telling them they did a good job that's not meaningful to them, right? They're looking for things that enhance their opportunities. So if you look in Red Dead Redemption, you know, as you progress, you get, you know, sort of a sniper rifle, and now you have a new opportunity. So it's very rewarding because it's unlocking new opportunities and modes of play. And, you know, this isn't always easy to get right. So we did some detailed studies a few years ago when Assassin's Creed came out, and we found that the unlocking of the abilities that the player had, you know, moving from free running to blending and stealing to assassinations, that was very satisfying to the player because it was creating this increased opportunity space for them to create their own stories and, again, behave more autonomously. But interestingly, the weapon system, and this is true, this has been true even of the more recent Assassin's Creed, really doesn't give them that same sense of autonomy satisfaction, because basically they're min-maxing. You go from fists to having a rusty knife to having a sharp knife to having a more sharp knife. And so even though you might have all this other stuff in your arsenal, you really only have one meaningful thing in your arsenal, and it's the best thing, right? And so, you know, you have to think through that. It's not just about creating a bunch of things. It's about creating things that give people meaningful choices as they move through. So anyway, this is really, we've gone through this very quickly, but this is really the summary of the autonomous player, right? That there's progressive growth. We haven't had a lot of time to go into relatedness, but we've touched on it because it's a very important psychological need. And it's this idea of creating this volitional engagement for the player. And now I'm going to turn back over to Troy to just close out a bit on the implications of all this for market success.
So what I wanted to do was go through, we talked about how certain genres sustain less, certain genres sustain more. And I kind of wanted to show you a transition from the heyday of narrative games in 2001 through 3, where they made the most profitable revenue in the market, what the motivations in those games were, and how things have changed in a practical way in games since then. So if you go back to the good old days, it's well represented still by things like Uncharted and BioShock Infinite. What are the motivations for the player? Well, there's the core mechanics, there's the narrative, there's the fact that there's magnificent set pieces, and there's the cinematics. When we test people and say, like, what drives you through the game, this is what comes up, right? So you make the next step forward into a relatively simple open world game like Arkham City. And what increases the motivations of the players? The world's bigger, which automatically there's more activities in it. There's open architecture, so instead of having to do what the game tells them to do, they have more choices over the ordering or which things they want to do. All of this increases anticipated satisfaction, but this is really an interesting point, because if you look at consumer data, this is what happens. They look at a big open world, and they see there's navigation challenges, they see there's Riddler puzzles, they see there's side quests, and they see there's the main narrative. And this is universal through most open world games. Players will go and try one taste of every type of thing in the game. And then there's really a test. Was it good? Do I want to do more of it? Or am I done with it? And there's certain rules that make things good, which I'm going to develop in other titles. But just the fact that there's more, what you can basically see is in Arkham Asylum, the narrative alone sustained players for 6 days. Arkham City, with all these other activities, got another 3 days. And a lot of that's people trying things, but it not sticking. There are some examples of things that work better, and I'll develop that in the other games. Assassins has a very similar pattern. They've had 6 versions of the open world instead of 2 in Arkham's case, so there's more stuff in there. There's more things that have to be tried, even if not all of them are things that people want to keep doing. They also have more things that have light RPG mechanics. We don't have the data in on this yet, but I would bet money that with Black Flag, the pirate ship, recruiting a crew, that's the kind of things we talk about: progressive growth, more opportunities, things that are strongly themed, volitional, that's going to do better. But traditionally, a lot of the things in Assassins were things like collect feathers, collect sea shanties, hunt creatures. Like, there are things that people say, is this valuable to me? They try it, but it's not valuable enough to continue. So people, there's one instinct in open world games to put all these activities in there, but the real question is, are they going to sustain engagement? If not, it's a wasted development time, just incremental amount, more time. So you move into Red Dead, and this is interesting. They have the same exact pattern. There's tons of things in Red Dead that people barely do. They barely play five-finger fillet. They barely do horseshoes. There's not a lot of liar's dice being played. You get into hunting and flower picking, helps you make medicine, gets a little bit of money, has more utility. Some people are freaks for poker. They just lose a couple days in there. That'll happen. But the thing that when you look through all the activities that populate Red Dead, the thing that's really happening is they have side missions that they call stranger missions in the game. And those things all have really strong volitional pools that fit within the game world. So you're essentially, the stranger, a Western guy, Clint Eastwood, and someone says, please help me, stranger, someone's going to eat my cousin. Help me. If your role in the game is to be the Western hero, then that's a very strong narrative volitional pool. And what you saw is people tried all the activities and bounced off, but they went deep into the side content because it fit their ideas of what it was to be that character. And interestingly, if we go back to Arkham City, a lot of Arkham City's content was abstract, but they did have some things like the phone would ring and it would be a villain and he'd go, they're talking to Batman, if you don't get to this place in 5 minutes, I'm killing an innocent person. As Batman, that's a call to action. In that case, extremely volitional, everyone takes that mission. The completion rate something like 83%. You give them something like, please go smash this box, no volitional pool, not saving someone, or clean up some graffiti. Like 3% of people take those quests. And so a lot of it, you can see a massive contrast in how volitional and narratively inspirational that is. So these are kind of our simpler side of open world games that are definitely moving past strict narrative games. But look what happens when we click the button one more time. We move into GTA at 23 days. So what's going on here? Massive on a whole new scale. Not only is it massive, and this is something we talk about a lot. You know, Scott talked about this with telegraphing future opportunities. A city landscape that's simulated is so much more dense with opportunities than a prairie or some of these other cities that aren't as realized. Anything you see around GTA is an opportunity for action. If you see a plane, you can fly it. If you steal a car and a cop sees it, he pursues you. You shoot the cop, he calls in reinforcements. You stop those reinforcements, helicopters come out. You keep going, there's going to be tanks. You see a bank, you can set up a bank heist. Like everything is not just an abstraction of a gameplay possibility, like let's pick a flower or let's do, you know, a FedEx quest. Everything is a realized thing that really makes people say there's so many possibilities in the world. And the fact that not only are all those possibilities things that people understand because we live in real worlds and we recognize these given the theme of the game, but the world does a great job of modeling believable reactions that make people say there's a lot of things on my list that I want to tick off in this game before I move on. And then the next step beyond that is Skyrim. So what we have here is massive on a whole new scale. But now we've added deep progressive growth. We're getting into the thing that I talked about with Call of Duty, where now it's not just activities that just are intrinsically fun or not, that are volitional or not, but anything I engage in makes me more powerful, which then allows me more opportunities of things to engage in. It's one of the strongest DNA strands for sustaining engagement. In addition to that, GTA, you know, the latest one, you get to be 3 characters, but the writers decide what 3 characters you get to play, right? And there's some variety there, and they're interesting, they're well written. But Skyrim and Bethesda and their heritage is in a whole different place, where instead they put up 100 different volitional possibilities. You can get infected by a vampire and live that life. There's a civil war going on, pick a side. You want to become a wizard, go become a wizard. You want to buy a house, you want to get married, anything you can think of in the world, it's modeled and you can do. So instead of being chained to what the brand is or chained to what the designer thought the best story in the world is, they turn it over to the player and say, what story do you want your game to be about? When you do qualitatives with people in Skyrim, and I've talked to hundreds of consumers who play the game, everyone's version of Skyrim is a different version than the other person's. They all have their own game when we talk about a player being truly autonomous, getting to create their own stuff. And then what you see from that is that there's a huge difference in how long something like that sustains. If you go on to something like Xbox Live now and see what the 10 most played games are right now, Skyrim still, how many years past launch are we? Still one of the 10 most played games on Xbox. You go to Steam, still one of the 10 most played games on Steam. This is what's going on inside it. So, you know, one of the things that we talk about is you get in more of these mechanics that allow players to be more autonomous. You're going to increase the amount of time they play the game, the more investment they have in it, and subsequently how much time they put in the game and how much money your game makes. So just to summarize, you know, the front part of the presentation hopefully shows that sustained engagement is a key variable for commercial success. And then the key to understanding how to design and build for sustained engagement is focusing on the autonomous player. Players always need to feel volitional, not controlled. Players have to see meaningful past the progressive growth that they get to choose how they want to proceed through. And then they see deep and meaningful choices over goals and activities that keep bringing them back day after day and month after month. Thank you very much. I think we have a little time for questions.
So I think we have a couple minutes. I don't know. We're getting like 2 minutes, so that means we've got maybe 5. Sorry, I always do that to the poor guys in the orange shirts. So. Anyway, questions or mics here in the front? Yeah.
Hey, you guys obviously are focused on the core game market, but you also mentioned the universality of these psychological principles. I'm sure you guys have talked about how these principles apply to the casual market. Any thoughts on that in a minute and a half?
Yeah, sure. Well, there's another question, so we'll give you just like 45 seconds or less. No, actually, we've looked at the casual market. We've looked. One of the nice things about the model is since it's basically a fundamental model of human motivation, you will see the same pattern of need satisfactions and the importance of autonomy versus control operating. As a matter of fact, back in, I don't know, back when Zynga was first really hot, I kind of went after them a bit at a time when it wasn't very cool to do that because they had a lot of controlling mechanics in their games, you know, crops withering and whatnot.
Puppies dying.
And puppies dying and things like that. You know, those things will work to manipulate you in the short term. If I want everybody in this room to jump out of their seats in the short term, cattle prod, awesome idea. But you're not coming back to my next lecture, right? And so that's basically the issue around control mechanics versus autonomy support. Yeah.
If you think that there's any way to apply some of these principles to the racing genre, if you think the racing genre ever has a chance of kind of regaining a foothold.
You know, I think one of the reasons why the racing genre was such a huge genre 10 years ago is because they actually have a lot of this stuff, and there's tons of progressive growth around getting to better tracks, getting to better cars, et cetera, et cetera. And I think a lot of times, if you know, I didn't put all the data in here because it's just not time, but a lot of times people have done very interesting things like move racing out into the city, giving people more choices about how to proceed. I think there's been some really inventive things that have resuscitated that over time. So I do think that's a possibility. It's just one of the things that happens is when racing was on top of the world, it was competing against 8 to 12-hour games, and the amount of progressive growth they had was ridiculous. Once you get into World of Warcraft, Skyrim, Call of Duty, it starts to be, in a relative sense, not as potent as it was when it was competing against Metal Gear Solid.
Yeah.
So it's not like you can't solve that problem. The principles of motivation design always work, but people always experience things relative to the other choices.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's one of the reasons why mobile games do so well. It's not that they're better per se than World of Warcraft. They're better than waiting in a bank line.
Yeah.
So it's a relative question that makes it so challenging. Not that they don't have access to these successful models.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I think we have time for probably just one more, and then afterwards if people want to come talk to us or do whatever. But sorry, I didn't mean to chase you. I don't know who was first. Yeah, sir.
As far as I know, Dota 2 is one of the mostly played games on Steam. Could you please explain how this idea works in the game?
About the autonomous player, well, so one of the things that Dota does extremely well, that's a tradition of MOBA, is obviously you have progressive growth in a round-to-round basis, a lot like Counter-Strike. So every game starts off and there's a constant set of progression, right? You level up constantly within a round, you get new abilities within the round, and that's always satisfying. So the fact that, you know, like in something like MMO, your progression levels off, right? People don't have enough content to keep that going for thousands of hours, so it gets less satisfying over time. In Dota, they reset the clock, or MOBAs reset the clock in each round, and so you always get the sense of growth in every round, and there's always a sense of, I'm the fastest to get to the top end, I'm going to be very powerful in this match, and so there's lots of other things going on in there, but that's one piece to talk about.
As well as having the meta level of progression as well, so they're kind of they're creating a density there.
And there's also which character you choose, all the different abilities, that's all autonomy. There's tons. It's not a one-trick pony.
So thanks again. We'll stick around for a couple minutes if we miss some people, but appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.